Brothers and sisters, tonight's celebration is all about the goodness and the love of our God, our Father, so generously poured out to us. Goodness and love poured out and reaching its summit in Jesus, whose goodness and love has been seen by us and has taught us. Humble service and charity and total self-giving of Jesus in the Eucharist and by the command that we do the same. That is tonight's celebration. But first, may I share perhaps a familiar story. On 2 days during the year, a certain doctor goes upstairs to his closet and takes out of it a coat that is out of style. One sleeve is patched, and it's rather tawdry and stringy and dirty. He showed it to me one day, and I asked him why he wore it on certain days of the year. And he told me that once when he was an intern in New York, in Lower Manhattan, he got a call one very blustery, cold, wintry night. A little girl came banging at his door. He threw on his jacket and he went over to a stinking tenement of very dirty stairs and into a one-room apartment where a little boy lay terribly sick. His mother and father were hovering over him. He did what he could for the malnourished child, but in spite of his best efforts, the little boy died then and there in front of him. The doctor was shivering, not only from the hurt of the boy dying, but because there was no heat in that apartment. The boy's father took off his coat, this very coat, and gave it to him and said, "Here, you're cold. Thank you for trying to save my child." The doctor knew then and there that that was the only way this couple could possibly thank him. He didn't have the heart to refuse or to give it back. And now that he's a prominent and fairly wealthy physician, once or twice a year, on the anniversary of that boy's death, and the day that he got his diploma to be a doctor, he wears that coat to remind himself what it's all about. Brothers and sisters, the doctor's coat was a yearly reminder of who he was, and what he was, and what his life was all about. And that is the doctor to pour out love, to pour out healing, to pour out compassion, because he was a doctor. That was his profession. What this situation was for the doctor in this story, the same venue and message is for all of us. Not because we are professional people doing secular work as he did, but because we are disciples of Jesus, invited to pour out his goodness and his love. Tonight we celebrate what our lives are all about. We have not put on a doctor's coat, brothers and sisters, but we remember that years ago we put on a white baptismal garment, or perhaps recently put on a brown Capuchin habit, consecrated disciples of Jesus. When I was stationed in Philadelphia, once a week each one of us held what was called the beeper. Perhaps Francis remembers this. Once a week we held the beeper, and when we held that beeper for 24 hours, during the night and during the day, we had to respond to it whenever that beeper went off. We didn't like that beeper, because for me, it always went off about 2 o'clock in the morning. And I'd have to crawl out of bed, and I'd have to put on my habit, and I'd have to go out the back door, especially when it was cold, and make my way down to Jefferson Hospital and into an emergency room that looked like it was noonday. Went over and you would find perhaps a young boy who had been in a severe accident, or you would find perhaps an elderly priest in his clerical garb with no identification who had died. I was there not to wash feet, but I was there to anoint the forehead and to comfort families who gathered around, so that they would know the presence of Jesus. And after I left there, I would be on my way back home. And I would say to myself, you know, this is what it's all about. I am a priest, and I'm called in the middle of the night to be with people who are hurting and suffering and dying, to anoint them, to comfort them, and to bring healing to them. Brothers and sisters, tonight is all about the command to wash dirty feet. The institution of the Eucharist, the body and blood of Jesus, who, as Francis tells us, hides himself so humbly in an ordinary piece of bread. And the charity and service of ordained priesthood that is instituted because of what took place this night in that upper room. Tonight's threefold celebration is a reminder of who Jesus is, what Jesus did, and what is commanded for all of us to do on this night. We can ask the question, is there any connection between the washing of dirty feet, the institution of the Eucharist, and ordained priesthood? Yes, they're all connected. My brothers and sisters, the goodness of God, capital G, the goodness of God necessarily pours out. Francis of Assisi, in his earlier rule, says to us, our only true God, who is the fullness of good, all good, every good, true and supreme good, who alone is good. And then he adds the pouring out. God, who is good, pours out his love. He is merciful, gentle, delightful, and sweet. As Franciscans, we believe that our God, who is good, who is all good, pours out love, capital L, pours out love. God, who is good, pours out love because it is the very nature of God. This pouring out of love we see all around us and within us in our world that we enjoy. The beauty of creation, all coming to life at this time of the year. Trees and flowers and warmer air, the songs of birds, the beauty and the dignity of all human life, all waiting for Jesus. This pouring out of love and of all creation reaches its summit with Jesus. The summit, the reason, and the crown of all creation is Jesus. As St. Paul tells us, in him everything in heaven and on earth was created, things visible and invisible. All were created through him. All were created for him. He is before all else that is. In him everything continues in being. God becomes flesh and blood. The Father pours out his love by giving to us his only Son, who in turn will pour out his love for us in humble service. He will wash feet. He will pour out his love for us in the Eucharist and in his suffering and death on the cross, which we will begin to celebrate tomorrow. Jesus, the humility of God personified in human nature. Born in poverty, worked with his hands, preached the truth with his voice, listened to heartaches with his ears, and with his hands touched the sinful and the lepers with the goodness and the love of his Father, complete and perfect charity. What we celebrate tonight, that the love of Jesus is perfectly shown to us in practical and visual ways. The goodness is poured out not just in an easy love, but in a sacrificial love. Jesus washes dirty feet with profound humility. Why? Because this is what Jesus is all about. He empties himself in perfect love and charity. He then goes on to empty himself when he shares his very body, blood, soul, and divinity in the Eucharist, food for body and soul, and then tells his 12, he commissions them to go out and to do the same. You know, this humble ritual of washing feet and the sacrificial meal of Jesus is a preview of the suffering death of Jesus that will happen this weekend. Commissioning the 12, he says, "Do this in remembrance of me," thus the beginning of ordained priesthood. But Jesus also commands, not just the 12, but all of us, you must wash each other's feet. Washing the soiled feet of travelers took place when one entered a home. It was also a sign of hospitality and a sign of charity. It was the very lowly job of a servant. But this is what our God has chosen to do in Jesus, loving and serving the lowliness and sinfulness of humanity. And now we come into the picture. We must wash each other's feet. And we too must do so with love, capital L, and humility. We do so because we are consecrated and basically because we are a good people. And our goodness pours out in sacrificial love. We won't be washing feet tonight. After all, it's a symbolic ritual, usually where clean and well-manicured feet are washed. But that ritual certainly reminds us that we must wash, brothers, dirty feet. The feet of the poor, the homeless, the sick, the outcast, the troubled, and the sinner. We are commanded to do what Jesus did. So tonight is a night of remembering, celebrating, and doing. We relive, we remember, and celebrate the Eucharist, where we have the awesome privilege of celebrating the suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and then feeding upon his body and blood. Real food, capital R, real food for our sanctification and for our strength to perform our humble works of charity. And we celebrate who we are as disciples, filled with goodness and love for all others. I want to end tonight with two scenarios, two accounts of two bishops that we know and we love, who, like the doctor in our story, they showed me what it's all about. First, Cardinal Wuerl. When I was at McGuire, it was in February, Sister Thaddeus received a message that Cardinal Wuerl, then bishop, was going to come to McGuire on Holy Thursday and celebrate Holy Thursday liturgy with us and our residents. Well, what's our first reaction? Cardinal Wuerl is coming. We need to make it right. We need to make it perfect. So he came, and we went into our assembly room. We set up the chapel. Cardinal Wuerl was preaching his homily, and I was sitting about away from Matthew, maybe even closer from Cardinal Wuerl. And we had chosen 6 people to have their feet washed. And those 6 were in the front. And one of them's name was AJ. AJ began to giggle and laugh during Bishop Wuerl's homily. I could feel the heat coming into my face. He was preaching this wonderful Holy Thursday homily, and AJ was giggling and laughing. Finally, I notioned to somebody, please take AJ out. So they lifted AJ and they took him out, and we brought up a fellow to have his feet washed to take his place. There were 6. So we went on with the liturgy. We washed feet. The cardinal washed feet. And it came to the end of the liturgy, and before Cardinal Wuerl said the closing prayer, he said, AJ was over there, he said, bring him over. And he washed AJ's feet. Brothers, that's what it's all about. Taking care with compassion and love. The second account I want to share before I stop is Bishop Zubik. Bishop Zubik came to McGuire after Cardinal Wuerl came to Washington, and he too didn't have liturgy, but he went to each room. And Bishop Zubik met every individual said hello, and every staff member. And he went into this one room where Casey was. Casey was ambulatory and able to walk. Bishop Zubik went over and extended his hand and said, hello, AJ, how are you? AJ took the bishop's hand and wiped his nose. Bishop Zubik very simply took a towel and wiped his hand and continued to meet and to talk with Casey. Brothers, that's what it's all about. It's all about serving in a lowly and a humble way, nourished by the Eucharist, giving, self-emptying ourselves for the love of Jesus and all of God's people.
Amen.